able to join us. So hello everybody, thank you so much for joining us. This is Barb Cardell. I am the PWN Training Director, and I want to welcome everybody to our third webinar for Organizing for Power. We went back and forth a couple of times about what exactly we should name this webinar. We ended up with Political Systems and Electoral Organizing, which sounds pretty lofty and elevated, but just to let everybody know, really what this is the nitty-gritty details of politics in the United States, how things fit together, and if we are seeking to impact electoral politics, what we need to understand to be able to do that. So thank you all for joining us. We're going to go ahead and do a presenter introduction in a moment. Just a couple of logistics. This webinar is being recorded, so if you would like to go back and listen again, you will have access to it. It'll be on the PWN website, and we will also share the link with everyone tomorrow, as if we can get it linked. If not, it'll be on Thursday. So everybody on the webinar will be in attendee mode, which means that you'll be muted. If you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat box. We are asking that unless you have something that you want to tell just the panelists, please make sure that you are sharing your chat with all attendees. That means that everyone can see it, and occasionally we have really, really good questions that are just directed at the panelists, and we don't have a chance to share that with everybody. So yes, if I've got a little spinach stuck in my teeth, please go ahead and send it to the panelists so that I can know, but otherwise, everything else, feel free to share with all of the attendees, because we are just here to learn and to help each other as we are doing this amazing thing called Organizing for Power. So we will have time for questions and answers throughout the presentation, and I'll go ahead and keep an eye on the chat box. If you do have a question that you feel is too complicated and you can't just type it in, because sometimes our fingers don't keep up with our brains, go ahead and click on the raise your hand, and we'll go ahead and unmute you so that you can go ahead and ask the questions. Our agenda for today is to talk a little bit about the Positive Women's Network. We like to start off every one of our webinars with that, so that we all have a good understanding of where we're coming from and why this is so important. Then we're going to be talking about the U.S. political systems and their impacts on electoral organizing. We're going to learn about the Electoral College. We're going to talk about issues-based ballot initiatives and legislative issues. Then we're going to have a little bit of team homework. You know, we're now getting into really doing a lot of the work as we're moving forward, and so each of our webinars will have a little bit of homework that hopefully don't take people too long, but kind of get you ready as we're getting moving into our boot camp. And then we'll have time for question and answers and discussion. So just a little bit about the Positive Women's Network. We were formed in 2008 when an incredible group of 28 women living with HIV came together from across the United States. This was the very first article that Wahida wrote about why PWN came together, why it was so important for women living with HIV and women of trans experience living with HIV to have our own network. What we realized was that as HIV was being funded and talked about on a national level, that our voices were not a part of the conversation. So our mission is to prepare and involve women living with HIV in all our diversity in all levels of policy and decision making. And I think it is no more present. Like, got a little tongue-tied there, sorry. I get so excited when I talk about PWN that literally I sometimes forget my words. It is so present when we talk about our organizing for power and impacting our election, especially as we plan that sort of long ramping up for the 2020 election. So what we do is we build leadership. We analyze and advocate on issues that are impacting all people living with HIV, knowing that if we address issues that impact women living with HIV and people of trans experience who are living with HIV, that we are impacting our communities as well as our friends and allies who are living with HIV. We organize and mobilize. We change the story, and we make sure that we're the ones who are telling that story. And as always, all of our work is grounded in racial, gender, and economic justice. I pulled this quote from our very first Organizing for Power introductory webinar, where Wahida was still one of our staff members, and she said, "We fight for our rights and safety. Without them, we die on the inside. When our voices are silenced on the outside, we disappear. We refuse to be ignored. Our lives matter, and we will save ourselves." And many of you might not know that Wahida was one of our founding members. She has been around with PWN since 2008. And I feel that this statement reflects why we are preparing ourselves, why we are organizing for power, and why we're doing some really intense and really deep learning around electoral politics. Because this is complicated stuff, and a lot of times we just sort of understand the very thinnest top layer, and that's all we need to do to be able to vote and to be impactful. But we want to get down to the grassroots and organize down there and make sure that we can share that knowledge with our communities as well. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Breanna to go ahead and introduce herself, and we'll just meet all of our presenters for today.
Awesome. Hey, y'all. Thanks again for being here tonight. My name is Breanna Diaz, and my pronouns are she, hers, and I'm the Policy Director for PWN.
Hi, everyone. My name's Kelly. I'm the If, When, How Reproductive Justice Fellow with PWN, but y'all know me as the Legal Fellow, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Great. And Rica, it looks like you've joined us. Do you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, everyone. This is Rica Rodriguez. My pronouns are she, hers.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. And Rica is the PWN co-chair, PWN Colorado co-chair, and is going to be talking today a little bit about some organizing that Colorado did this year around the General Assembly, but she is also a board member and a bunch of other amazing things that I just didn't have space. So, you know, Rica, thank you for joining us. And with that, I will turn it over to Breanna.
Awesome. Thank you, Barb. Yeah, so we're just going to briefly go over the government, pretty much the three branches of government that y'all will be working with throughout your OFP time. So if at any point you have questions about what we're going over, like please feel free to raise your hand or type something in the chat box. Barb will be able to respond in the chat box, and I'm happy to spend more time explaining something. This is complicated, but we're going to try to keep it as high line as possible. Click. Thank you, Barb. So yeah, like I said, there.
Hello.
Oh, we good? Okay, so thanks. So like I said, there are three branches of government that are mandated by the U.S. Constitution, and they are the legislative branch, which makes the laws, and that is composed of Congress, which is a bicameral legislative body, which means that it's composed of two houses. Or two chambers. One is the House of Representatives and one is the Senate. We'll get more into that later. The second branch of government is the executive branch of government, and that's the branch that executes the law or carries out the law. And that branch is composed of the President of the United States, the Vice President, and the president's cabinet, who we will get more into detail about who those individuals are. And the third branch of government is the judicial branch, or the court system, right? It is the judicial branch's job to interpret the laws. And again, the judicial branch is composed of the Supreme Court of the United States and all other federal courts, such as the Circuit Court of Appeals and the federal district courts. Cool. So the legislative branch, y'all are probably going to have the most interaction with these people, considering that we're doing electoral organizing. So yeah, just really basic stuff. The legislative branch is composed of the House and the Senate. So the House is composed of 435 members at the moment. Their length of terms are 2 years. And they are elected every even year on the calendar. So that's why you had that huge turnover in 2018 in the House, where we flipped the House from Republican to Democrat. Kelly snapping, sorry, I was distracted, but yes, excitement. So what happens is that in 2018, a majority of the House is up for election, and we were, due to really great electoral organizing, a lot of Republicans were voted out and replaced with Democrats. That same thing, or a similar election year, will be happening in 2020 for the House, right? And so there are a lot of duties that members of the House have, including, drafting revenue bills, so the appropriations process. They're able to impeach federal officials, which you might have seen with Representative Ayanna Pressley, actually just is serving a resolution for impeachment for Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And they also elect the president in case of an Electoral College tie. I know these duties might sound really like, what are those? Can you explain them more? They are very complicated, and we're happy to take questions on that if you have more. So yeah, that's the House in a nutshell. As to the Senate, there are 100 members. As you all know, or probably know, there are 2 senators per state, and so that makes up the 100. They are the higher house, or their House of Representatives is the lower house. Their length of term is 6 years, and they are staggered every even year. So 1/3 of Senate seats are up for election. Every 6 years, right? So really good opportunity to flip the House or flip the Senate a little bit in 2020. So the Senate has a couple duties as well. They ratify treaties and they confirm the presidential appointments that require, so typically a president is able to nominate somebody for a political position or for a judicial position, but only the Senate can confirm that individual. The Senate is able to convict impeached officials except for the president. That impeachment process is overseen by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Again, complications, happy to cover later. I think the critical piece of information here is knowing how many members make up the House, how many members make up the Senate, how long their terms are, and when they are elected. Next. So yeah, review of the legislative process. Bills don't come, laws just don't come out of nowhere, right? They typically start with a concept or an idea of something that, you as a community member would like to see done. You bring it to your state legislature or your federal representative and you say, I want this to become a law, right? So that idea becomes a bill. The bill is then sponsored by a legislator, so that can be a representative or a senator. But that's not enough to really have it become a law. There's a really long community or education outreach campaign that goes about that, where you have to get more co-sponsors or more legislators to support your bill, right? So then you go through that process, you get enough co-sponsors, there's enough interest, if everything's going great, it then goes to a committee. Both the House and the Senate are composed of various committees on a lot of different issues. So for example, there will be a Senate and a House side subcommittee or committee on the judiciary, right? And so that committee on the House side and the Senate side oversees a lot of issues impacting civil rights. So think immigration, think voting rights, law enforcement oversight, those kind of issues, right? If your bill touches on one of those issues, then it would go to that particular committee. If the bill is then voted out of committee, it has to get a hearing in a committee, in its respective committee, and then has to get voted out of that committee, and it is put onto the floor of the legislature. So you had your concept, it went into a bill, it got its sponsors, made it to committee, made it out of committee, and now it's on the House or Senate floor. The House and Senate have to vote on it. Both houses or both chambers have to vote on it, right? And let's say both chambers vote in favor of your bill, huzzah, hooray, it goes to the president for a signature. And if the president signs that bill, it then becomes a law. There is, all of this. It's a lot. It's a very complicated process, and it's really annoying. But this is democracy at work, right? Checks and balances and whatnot. There is an exception to where if the executive or the president decides not to sign the bill into law, he or she or they can veto it. It goes back to the legislative branch, but with a 2/3 vote, they can override the president's veto, and then it becomes law, right? So there's all these things that make up the legislative process, but this is a super 101 overview of that concept of how a bill becomes a law. Next. All right, so on to the executive branch. So the executive branch, as I said, is composed of the President of the United States, or POTUS. I don't know if you've ever heard that acronym before, written anywhere, or just heard that really funky name. POTUS is President of the United States. And the president has multiple roles as the executive, right? He, she, or they are the commander-in-chief. That means that they are head of our military, armed forces, etc. They're also the head of state, so they can also represent us at the international level, or the United States at the international level, that kind of stuff. The executive branch is also composed of the vice president and 14 heads of executive agencies. So I have a graphic here of the 14 executive agencies. So that is the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Department of State, like all of those that you've ever heard, and they're headed by a secretary. The secretary is the leader of that respective agency, and that person is appointed by the president. And that person then becomes a member of the president's cabinet. It's really fun. So yeah, typically the vice president and the heads of the executive agencies, they kind of stay within their respective roles. We all know the vice president. We always see that photo up with the president, them together, running together on the ticket. But the vice president really doesn't have that much power. It's only in our recent history that I think that executive power has expanded greatly, particularly under the George W. Bush administration. And now under the Trump administration with Mike Pence, Vice President Mike Pence, having a lot of influence over the Trump administration and passing a lot of discriminatory policy, right? But I think the primary importance here is to know that the line of succession, where if anything ever happens to the president, next in line is the vice president. If anything happens to the vice president, next in line is the Secretary of State. So I think that's just a key takeaway, is there is a line of succession, and that line is composed of the vice president and the 14 heads of the executive agencies. So yeah, a president may only serve 2 terms totaling 8 years. However, there is an exception in the 22nd Amendment where an individual may serve 2 years of a different president's term and then run for 2 additional terms of 8 years. So if they get all that, then technically somebody can be president for 10 years. That has never happened before, but who knows? Like, who knows? Next. Cool, so last branch of government is the judicial branch. Like I said, it's composed of about 3 levels, the lowest being the district court. So that is the lowest level in the federal system. It's 94 judicial districts in 50 states and territories. And it's where most cases originate, right? So if you want to sue somebody at the federal level, you're going to start in the district court and make your way up, maybe. The next one is the Circuit Court of Appeals. It is the intermediary federal court level of the federal system. There's 12 circuit courts and the DC court. It's just a lot of stuff. And then the final court, the highest court in the land, is the U.S. Supreme Court. There are 9 justices that compose the Supreme Court. Fun fact, there's nothing that actually dictates that. There's no law, there's no constitutional requirement. That's just something we've decided as throughout our history that we'll have 9 justices. So that's just the way it is. It's funny. So those are pretty much the key takeaways of the judicial branch. So next. Okay. On to the next fun stuff. Political process 101. Kelly, take it away.
Okay, so from here, we're actually going to play a little bit of a game. Next slide. Okay, so the game is, I am going to define these 4 terms. I'm not going to tell you what order I'm going to define them in. Your goal is to guess which term I'm talking about. So we're going to start. So all I want you to do is when you think you know what we're talking about, type it into the chat box. We'll see who gets it right. Okay, so for the first term, there are 435 of these. On average, each one represents 747,000 people. And its definition is it's a territorial division of a state from which a member of the U.S. House of Representatives is elected. Do we have any guesses? Oh, I see it. All right, congressional district. Click. Yeah, very good. Okay, so that's the general way that the game goes. Nice job. It'll probably get easier as we do more. Click. All right, the next one is a very competitive election race where either party or candidate has a good chance of winning. Yes, toss up. Very good. Click. Click. All right, our next one, I'm going to start by telling you some of the places that fit into this category. Colorado, Florida, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Wisconsin. Oh, y'all are on it. Very nice. Okay, so this is any state that could reasonably be won by either Democratic or Republican presidential candidates. The opposite of a swing state is a safe state, and that state that regularly leans to one party. So think California blue, Texas red. All right, and the last one, which I think y'all are going to be able to get it at this point. But so this is the lowest level of government-related division of land in the U.S. You might also consider it an electoral district, one of several areas, each containing a polling place into which a town or city is split for voting purposes. That's correct. That is a precinct. So just think of it as a small, like one of the smallest areas, and it's going to define where you vote. All right, great job. Next. All right, so now we're going to get a little bit deeper here. These terms are, I think, a little bit more difficult. Maybe not the first one. Okay, so next term, here we go. Republican, Democrat, Green, Libertarian, Constitution, Socialism, and Liberation. It's an organized body of people who work to get candidates elected to office who have generally like-minded policy commitments and political ideologies. Yes, very good. Political party. Click. Click. All right, the next one is private meetings run by political parties held at the county, district, or precinct level. In most, participants divide themselves into groups according to the candidate they support. Then undecided voters form their own group. Each group gives speeches supporting its candidate and tries to get others to join its group. In the end, the number of voters in each group determines how many delegates a candidate has won. Very nice. So that was a little bit harder. That is indeed a caucus. Very good. All right, and click. Our next one is, so a primary, just to define that really quickly, in a primary election, people can vote for candidates or write-in candidates to represent their party in local, state, or federal elections. So the term that I'm going to define now is a primary where only voters registered in that party are allowed to vote. Closed primary, very, very good. And you can contrast this with an open primary in which a person from any party is allowed to vote in that primary election. And then the last one is a meeting of delegates of a political party to select candidates for office at the local, state, or national level. The big national convention, I should check and see. Political convention, very good, very nice. And so the big national conventions are where the Democratic and Republican nominees for the 2020 election are going to be selected. So that was great. You all did amazing. So I just want to kind of group together all of these words that are on the screen right now and explain why they're important. One of the really big takeaways from this is that determining who's on the ballot is something that can happen really, really locally in your precincts through caucuses and closed primaries. And they also happen nationally in big party conventions. But in order to get into these things, your political party is very important. So for example, if you want to be able to vote in a Republican primary, often you have to be registered Republican very often. Or if you want to have a say in who the Democratic candidate for president is going to be, you have to be registered Democrat. And so I just wanted to clue you all into that as you're considering registering with a specific party. And next slide. All right, back over to Breanna.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelly. And I'm so excited that like everybody knew those terms. Wow. Like everyone was awesome. Cool. So yeah, going back to levels of representation, we kind of just want to briefly highlight how you'll be working at the municipal or local level, the state level, and federal, and how that maps out across the levels, right? It's pretty much just a mirror image from local, state to federal. So The executive at the local or municipal level is typically the municipal executive, which means like the head of city council, something like that. At the state level, the executive is the governor, and then at the federal level, it's the president. This is, again, exists in the legislative realm of the local, state, and federal level as well. So at the local level or the municipal level, this is city council. They are the city legislature. That's who it is. At the state level, I use South Carolina as an example. I pulled this from a former presentation. So if anyone from South Carolina is on, you have seen this before. At the state level, the higher legislative chamber is the South Carolina Senate. At the federal level, the Senate would be the United States Senate. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, municipal level executive could also be a mayor. So at the lower legislative chamber, that doesn't really exist at the local level, but it does exist at the state level. And that would be in South Carolina, the House of Representatives. I live in Virginia, and so my my representative level here at Virginia is actually called the General Assembly. And the General Assembly is composed of delegates. So if your state has delegates and senators at the state level only, I'm not talking federal, only state. If you have a delegate, that is a representative. That's an interchangeable term. The term is just dictated by your state's locale, like your state and their history. I don't know why the northeastern states like to be difficult like that. They prefer delegate to representative, but it is the same thing. There is no difference. And then again, at the federal level, it is the U.S. House of Representatives. How fun. So how do these individuals get selected, right? So like throughout your OFP work, you're probably going to be looking at a lot of district maps. And you might see that the district maps for a federal level representative and senator is going to look a lot different than the state district map for state representatives and senators. And so we wanted to provide an example of that. Here we have Michigan, which is a swing state in the election. I'm sure many of you know that. And this is an example of, to my left, looking at it at the presentation, is the district map for U.S. House of Representatives. So these are individuals who represent the state of Michigan in the U.S. House of Representatives. So that's just an example of what a district map looks like. To what is my right is just a picture of Michigan, because every state is given 2 senators, that's it, and you vote for both of your state senators. It doesn't matter about district mapping. District mapping at the federal level is only relevant for the House of Representatives. Next. Oh, thank you for that note. So at the state level, there's a lot more districts because you're voting for people to elect you at the state level in the Michigan state government, right? So over to my left, we see that Michigan has 110 House districts for the Michigan, House of Representatives. And then to my right, we see that Michigan has 38 Senate districts. So their state senator, like legislative body, is 38 individuals. So if you're doing electoral work or wondering who your state rep is and who your federal representative is and how that's decided, checking your district map is really critical information. So yeah, fun question. How are districts drawn? Because none of that makes sense. Who gets to select it? It really doesn't make sense, to be honest, but we're gonna learn more. Click. So one way that district maps are drawn is the census. So every 10 years, the government sends out the census for everybody to take. I mean, this administration didn't want everybody taking it, but typically you fill it out every 10 years. And the purpose of the census is to determine political representation and federal funding. So what this means is that federal districts, when we looked at that Michigan map, the first one that we looked at, that was a U.S. House of Representatives, those districts, how they're drawn, how many are drawn, is determined by the census, right? So those numbers can change. So just because you have 435 individuals in the House of Representatives, how many of those individuals come from Michigan, that can be determined by the census. If population grows, you have more representation. If population shrinks, you have less representation, right? Fun stuff. And so this is really good to think about. Recently, the Trump administration tried to add a question of citizenship to the 2020 census, right? And that was clearly a tactic to scare people of color, low-income people, and people with varying immigration statuses not to take the census, because we all know that there are states with large, marginalized populations, and if we actually had fair representation of those populations in a state like Texas, the district being mapped can look way different and have a significant impact on federal elections. So that's what the census is. It informs one aspect of districts. What's the next one? Gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is really fun. Has anyone ever heard of gerrymandering before? Yeah? Okay, cool. Yes. Yeah, it's garbage. Right, so there are two different versions of gerrymandering that y'all are probably familiar with or should at least know about. One is racial gerrymandering, and this is a way that, let me back up. So typically gerrymandering is done by the one political party in power. So for example, here in Virginia, we recently had Republicans draw our district maps based on the racial gerrymandering thought process. And what that was is that the one political party in power gets to draw the maps for their state. Super unfair. And so one way to make sure that a majority or the controlling party maintains their hold over a state is to draw the lines, right? To dilute the vote of certain individuals. And so one way to do that is racial gerrymandering. And so what that does is that individuals will draw your district map to put people of color, to dilute the vote of people of color by diluting their vote. And it's like separating them into overwhelmingly white districts. So like our vote doesn't matter, right? Horrible. The same thing exists for partisan gerrymandering. So if you have districts that are overwhelmingly Democrat and then some that are overwhelmingly Republican, you can draw the controlling party can draw the district map to keep those individuals together in that same district to always control or that district. So you always have an incumbent in office. Or they can do the opposite and draw it in a way where a party has way less power, right? It's all just controlling who has power and why they have power. Yeah, I think I'm gonna leave it there. Unless Kelly, did you want to add anything here? Okay, cool. Click. Gerrymandering sucks. All right, take it away, Kelly.
Okay, so with that, we're going to turn to the Electoral College. And don't worry, I'm going to get into specifically what that is. But what we're going to be talking about for the next couple of slides is the process that we use in the US to elect a president. Click. So normally when we think about voting, when we think about the US, we're a democracy. We go out and we vote, and we think one person, one vote. That's how this is supposed to work, and then the majority wins. But click. That's not actually how it happens in the US. In the US, when we're electing the president, we have this really complicated process, and it's known as the Electoral College. What you're seeing on the map up there is actually how many electoral votes every state gets to cast when we're going through the process of figuring out who's going to be president. And so just a little bit of a background. Originally, the procedure for the Electoral College was in Article 2 of the Constitution, but that original process was an absolute mess. And so the procedure that we use today is actually found in the 12th Amendment. And the really important thing to note, the reason that that matters, is that the Electoral College is written into our Constitution, making it really hard to change. But the specifics, so things like how electors are chosen, which we'll also go over, those aren't in the Constitution. So those states have a significant hand in forming and crafting policy around. Next. Click. Okay, so let's think, we're going to talk about the Electoral College. We're talking about voting for president. So we're going to start on the Tuesday after the first Monday of November, general election day, when everyone goes out and they're going to cast a vote for president. When is that for 2020? Who knows? Who's like up on the beat? Who has that date? What day is general 2020? Click. It is November 3rd. So just mark that down on your calendar. There we go. All right. Good. And click. So you go over on November 3rd, you go to the ballot box, you vote for president and others down the ballot. Who on here has voted for president before? Shoot a yes in the chat box if you have. If you haven't, that's cool. That's why we're here. That's why we're doing get out the vote work. I see a yes. I see a yes. We have some voters out there. We have a lot of voters out there. What? All right. Look at these yeses streaming in. All right. Click. It was a trick question. So you don't actually vote for president every 4 years. Click. You vote for electors, and those electors promise to vote for the candidate that you chose when you went in and voted for a specific person. Click. All right, so we're going to go over the number of electors. So that map that I showed you before, how it had all those different numbers on every state, this is the way that they're calculated. So basically, electors are the number of Congress people that each state has. So we have 100 senators, and we have 435 House of Representative members, and that equals 538 votes in total. No, right? That doesn't. That would equal 535, except DC is an exception. They sort of throw a wrench into things. DC has no Congress people, but they get 3 electoral votes anyway, which is good because we want DC to have representation. But so that is how we get to 538. And then I want to go over a little bit who these electors are. So each party is going to have its own slate of electors. I kind of made one up for Idaho right here. This isn't actually the way that it looks, but this was the easiest way for me to understand what's going on here. So you see that Idaho does actually have 2 different districts. They have 2 House representatives, and they have 2 senators. That's that little thing that says at large. So each of the parties is going to choose someone to represent the district and 2 people for at large. So they've chosen 4 people each. Now, whoever wins the general election in Idaho, all 4 of those electoral votes from either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party are going to go to the people that are listed either in blue or in red. So let's say the Democrats win, or the Democratic candidate wins in Idaho, then that blue line, LW, YL, KP, and HT, whoever they are, they're going to be the electors from Idaho who go and cast their vote for president. Click next. All right, so what happens is the majority wins. We have 538 electors total, electoral votes in the Electoral College. So that means once a candidate makes 270 Electoral College votes, they win, they become president. And if no one gets to that 270 number, that what happens is it's thrown to the House of Representatives, and all of the representatives from every state sort of band together. So one state, one vote, and a simple majority wins. Next. So we're going to go into a couple of the problems with the Electoral College. And the first is that it really skews representation. So this map actually shows every state, and it's been resized in proportion to the relative influence that the individual voters have who live there. So I just want you to take a second and really appreciate how much bigger an impact a voter in a place like Wyoming has than a voter in a place like California. So it really skews the amount of power that individual voters have, which really gets at the heart of this idea that we have one person, one vote, when we really know that certain voters, their vote has more influence than others. Click. Click. Oh no, the sound's not on. Okay, well, I had a little bit of sound with that as well, but that's cool. So another huge, oh. It's okay. It was an ABBA song. It's all right, y'all. So a huge problem is that most states are winner takes all. So if a candidate gets even 51% of the votes in a state, they're going to get all of the electoral votes. Think back to that slate that I showed you in Idaho, how we had the green or the blue line and the red line, and we said, okay, maybe the Democrats win. But the Democratic candidate wouldn't have gotten 100% of the votes, and yet they do get 100% of the electoral votes. This leads to a situation where candidates actually can win the popular vote, but still lose the election because of how the electoral votes worked out. And then this situation also creates a scenario where candidates focus attention and money in very, very specific places, right? So if they know, as they often do presume, that the electoral votes in California are going to go to a Democratic candidate and the electoral votes in Texas are going to go to a Republican candidate, they're not going to focus a lot of attention and time and money in those states. They're not going to be doing outreach to those folks because they want to put those places where they're going to have the most. Click. There are only two exceptions. Only two states do not do this winner takes all method, and that is Maine and Nebraska. In those states, I'll just give you a bit of a background. So they actually do voting by district. So I showed you how there were 2 districts in Idaho. I think that there's 1 or 2 in Maine. I can't remember off the top of my head. But basically, whichever candidate wins those districts, then those electors who represent those districts are pledged to vote for that candidate. So it could be the case that it's not a winner takes all if 2 districts vote differently. But that's a little bit of a complication, and we can get back to that more if you would like more detail around that. Click. And then another interesting complication is that electors, once they're selected, don't actually have to vote for the candidate that they promised that they would vote for. So they're actually free to vote for a candidate other than the one to whom they're pledged. And this is true. So electors aren't required to vote for the person that they pledged in the Constitution or in federal law. 29 states do have state laws that require them to vote for their pledged candidate. Sorry, one sec. But courts have varied as to whether or not they think that's constitutional. So I'm going to show you an example in Washington. So Washington State has 10 House representatives. So they have 10 districts. They have 2 senators who are at large, and that gives them a total of 12 electors. Hillary Clinton won the state by 52% of the vote, but because Washington is a winner-take-all state, those 12 electors went to those 12 electoral votes went to the electors who promised that they would vote for Hillary Clinton, the Democratic electors. But what ended up happening was that a couple of them turned into faithless electors. So instead of all 12 votes going to Hillary Clinton, 8 went to Hillary, 3 went to Colin Powell, and 1 went to an independent candidate called Face Spotted Eagle. Next.
Before we go, Kelly, we do have a question about who gets to be an elector.
Oh, that's a great question. So for who gets to be an elector, so each party has its own slate, right? And the Constitution actually doesn't tell us how the electors should be chosen. Every state, each state has its own process for how it should happen. I can tell you the 2 most common methods that folks use to determine their electors, but it's going to be a state-by-state basis. So the 2 most common methods that are used are nomination in a state's party convention or nomination by a state party committee. So it really has a lot to do with the party and those who are in power in the party. And
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and so what's kind of interesting, so there's a great question about how we find out who the electors are. So it's a little bit difficult. You'll probably have to wait until your state has a convention in order to figure it out. And I actually did some research and had a lot of trouble finding slates that the Democrats and Republicans used in past elections. So it's something that I've been trying to research more as well, is how to make this information public. And then, so I have a question. The question on the screen is, right, but why? So why do we use this super weird procedure rather than just, I don't know, having a popular vote? Click. This is going to surprise absolutely no one on this webinar. But the reason is, like so many institutions in the US, racism. The 12th Amendment was proposed in 1803. It was ratified in 1804. And at the time, there were more than 500,000 slaves in the South. And if you remember from the last presentation that Barb gave, slaves couldn't vote because white male landowners were voters. And in a direct election under that system, the voting power in the North would have radically outnumbered the voting power in the South. And so instead, Madison proposed the Electoral College, and one of the compromises that was reached is something known as the 3/5 compromise, where the Southern states counted their slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of apportioning representatives. So when you think Electoral College, what you're really thinking of is the remnants of a deeply racist and dehumanizing policy intended to let white Southern men maintain their economic and political power. And today, it's still working as a way to consolidate power and isolate minority voters through this winner-takes-all method. Click. So let's look at an example of how the Electoral College functions. What you're seeing right here is a pointillism map from 2016. And when I say that, what I mean is every voter got a little dot. Blue, red, or I believe purple if they voted something other than Democrat or Republican. As you can see on this map, there's a lot of blue. That's because Hillary Clinton, the Democratic candidate, actually won the popular vote in 2016. Do you all know how many, like some guesses out there, throw some numbers out. How many votes do you think Hillary may have won by? 1,200. Let's see, 20,000, 200,000, 1 million. We're getting closer. Click. Almost 3 million votes. 2.86 million. Ooh, Kenya was very close. Click. Mm-hmm. Now, this is a map of how the Electoral College panned out. So you'll see the blue states are the states where the electoral votes went to Clinton. The red states, they went to Trump. Those of you who are quick at math, you might be able to see this already, but click. Trump won the Electoral College by 74 electoral votes. And so, this really represents one of the problems with the Electoral College. How does someone win by 3 million votes and still lose the presidential race? Click. So what are we going to do? We are going to burn it down. I'm going to just give you a really quick overview of some different ways that we could intervene in the Electoral College. So the first is, like I said, it's written into our Constitution, so we would have to do it through constitutional amendment. This is super crazy difficult because in order to have a constitutional amendment, you need 2/3 of the House and Senate, as well as ratification by 3/4 of the states. It's a hugely burdensome process. Another option would be to do the state-by-state method. So something like what we see in Nebraska and Maine, have it not be a winner-take-all method, but have rather apportionment by district to see which way those come out. But the movement that by far has the most strength and vitality and excitement behind it right now is the National Popular Vote Bill. So the winner-takes-all method of awarding electoral votes, that's state law, as we talked about. It's not in the U.S. Constitution. So what the National Popular Vote Bill would do, it's an interstate compact that would go into effect when it's enacted by states that are possessing a majority of electoral votes. So that is when they have enough states that say, yes, we agree to do this, to when they get to 270, so that you would have enough to win the Electoral College. So basically what would happen is this group of 270 plus presidential electors would pledge to support the candidate who received the most popular votes in all 50 states and DC. So they would essentially use the Electoral College in order to ensure that the popular vote is respected. Right now, They have 196 electoral votes that are pledged to do this, so they're still short some. But those are some options. Click. All right, from there I turn it back over to Breanna.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kelly. That was a lot of information about a intentionally difficult and confusing system. So we will definitely have time to answer questions. If you have any questions on your mind right now, feel free to put them in the chat box, and Barb and Kelly can try to respond. We know the Electoral College is really confusing, so we're happy to provide more time to talk about that if necessary. But we're almost at the end of the webinar. So now we're going to go over electoral organizing. So we've learned all about, the three branches of government. We've talked about the legislative process and how the legislative branch exists at the city, state, and federal level. And then we learned about the Electoral College, which, we can do all the galvanizing we want to get out the vote, but sometimes the Electoral College finds ways to undermine our vote. So we got to burn it down. Kelly with a great policy option there. So now electoral organizing, right? Like, why does all of this matter? And then why do we need to know this when we do our work? Click. So what is electoral organizing, you're asking? So Barb has this great definition that they've provided for us. Electoral organizing is relational organizing. That is person to person to shift the hearts and minds of voters to register to vote. And electoral organizing is also educating and mobilizing our community to impact election, to impact candidates, and to impact issue-based initiatives. So I know it might sound like after Electoral College saying, Breanna, get out the vote. It doesn't, clearly whatever. It just seems like really disheartening to know that you can do so much work and effort to get your community out there, and the Electoral College might undermine it. But no, it's not true. Our vote still matters, and we should always show up. And there are also some things that the Electoral College doesn't control, like state level, like issue-based ballot initiatives, right? So I have an example of that. Next. So I want to highlight the issue-based electoral organizing strategy, the Yes on 3 campaign from Massachusetts. Has anybody heard of this campaign before? It's recent. No, that's totally fine. So in 2016, Massachusetts passed, the state legislature passed a super awesome, inclusive, non-discrimination bill for transgender people. And it mandated that you were not allowed to discriminate in access to public accommodations. So that is gender segregated facilities, that can be restaurants, like that can be a whole slew of things. You could not discriminate in them on the basis of gender identity. Or it was like 2006, right? 2006. It was a great, great bill. But what happened is that, unfortunately, some people who oppose equality for LGBTQ people decided to turn this into a ballot initiative. And what that is that depending on your state, you can take pieces of law and contest them. Say the legislature doesn't speak for us on this issue. We want an overdo. We want to overturn this law, right? We disagree with it. The legislature did not represent us adequately when they made their decision. And so sometimes the state requires you get a certain amount of signatures before something becomes a ballot initiative. That's a whole other process. I'm happy to talk about it at a later time because it varies state to state. But what happened is that in Massachusetts, a bunch of anti-equality people got together and wanted to take away these protections for transgender people. And so they got enough signatures. They were able to get this issue on the 2018 ballot. And basically, it was a ballot initiative to repeal the transgender inclusive anti-discrimination law. Well, the community, the LGBTQ community, allies, that included parents of LGBTQ people, nonprofit and advocacy organizations, businesses, faith leaders, everybody you could think of got together and said, no, we're not going to let this ballot initiative come to fruition, right? We're going to defeat it. Like, we are going to keep our inclusive law in Massachusetts. And so it was a really, really long battle, but it all turned out super well. And it actually is the first ever statewide victory for transgender protections at the ballot box. So what that means is that I'll show you an image later of what the final vote was. It's really great. But what happened is that people in Massachusetts got out and they said, no, we want protections for the trans community. And they said, vote yes to uphold those protections by like a wide margin. Click. And so this is the final vote. So what happened is that in Massachusetts, what is it, 67, almost 68% of the vote, so 1.7 million people turned out and said, we want protections for transgender people, keep your hands off them. We got this right in 2006, and we're getting it right, in 2018. And the no votes are just sad, which is fine in this case. But I think the vote yes on 3 campaign is a really good example of where electoral organizing can have great success for issues that impact members of PWN, right? Yeah, next. And we're going to turn over to Rica to talk about the comprehensive sex education in Colorado.
My internet better cooperate. Can y'all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. So we kicked ass on this comprehensive sex education bill. It's House Bill 1032, Comprehensive Human Sexuality Education, Content Requirements, Grant Program Appropriation. So the act adds certain content requirements for public schools that offer comprehensive human sexuality education, including instruction on content as it relates to safe and healthy relationships and safe haven laws. The act prohibits instruction from emphasizing sexual abstinence as the primary or sole acceptable preventative method available to students, and prohibits instruction from explicitly or implicitly using shame-based stigmatizing language or instructional tools. It employs gender stereotypes and excluding the health needs of lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender individuals. So if a public school teaches comprehensive comprehensive human sexuality education, the public school is not required to include instruction on pregnancy outcome options. However, if the public school opts to provide instruction on pregnancy outcomes, it must cover all pregnancy outcomes options that are available. Current law provides for a comprehensive human sexuality education grant program. This act amends certain provisions of the grant to require the Department of Public Health and Environment to submit an annual report concerning outcomes of this grant for the program indefinitely. It adds 9 representatives to the oversight entity and requires membership of the oversight entity to represent diverse community perspective, and makes an effort to include committee members who are diverse themselves. It also requires grant applicants to demonstrate a need for money to implement comprehensive human sexuality education, and require that rural public schools or public schools that do not currently offer comprehensive human sexuality education, that they receive priority when selecting grant applicants. This act, it also prohibits the State Board of Education from waiving the content requirements for any public school that provides comprehensive human sexuality education. However, the act does not prohibit charter schools or institute charter schools from applying for a waiver, so people can still waive that. So Colorado, the PWN Colorado chapter, we used this issue as a screening question for our 2018 candidates. We testified when it was up in the House and the Senate committee. We advocated we advocated for it during our HIV advocacy day, and we delivered hundreds of letters in support of the bill when it was in its final vote in the Senate, and it looked like it might have failed. So it was a huge win for us. This meant that in 2019 and through 2020 fiscal year, the act appropriates $1 million from the general fund to the Department of Public Health and Environment to implement this act. And it was super fun. We got to know a lot of people, got to talk to our representatives, partnered with local agencies like Planned Parenthood, and we rocked the House. Do we have any questions? wasn't paying attention to the chat box.
No, but I think we have basically a lot of people who are really stoked that this passed in Colorado, and would like to use the language to draft something in Michigan or in a couple of other states as well. It was pretty exciting, and it also included language around consent. And so one of the sponsors talked about this being the first time that consent and training consent was going to be part of a comprehensive sex education program. So it's pretty exciting.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, and I forgot.
Yeah, no, of course. There was a lot of details in it, and for sure. And Breanna, can you talk a little bit about the difference between the issue in Massachusetts and how this is done in the General Assembly, and how that might impact people's understanding of where to impact those systems?
Yeah, for sure. So I think Rica did a great job at saying how, they use the comprehensive sex education bill to, talk with and impact legislatures, right? So state legislatures voted on that bill for it to become a law. So Rica was very targeted in who she went to with her asks, right? And the whole process, like she went through the legislative process that I briefly went over before with the pretty pictures of shapes. The thing with Yes on 3 is that it was a ballot initiative. So rather than going to your state legislature, you actually, you decide. You get to decide. It's a thing that you get to vote on, and the majority vote wins on that issue. So instead, your outreach can be directly with the community. That can be canvassing. That can be phone banking. That can be hustling, the text-based canvassing. So your target and who decides the outcome, I think, are different between what Rica did in Colorado and what I discussed in Massachusetts.
Yeah, thanks for that, Breanna. So this is the end of our content. It was really dense, and so now we have a chance to go ahead and talk about some questions. And while people are typing something in, I just want to go back to, so if you get motion sick, don't look, because I'm going to flip through our slides real quick. I want to go back here, and I want to talk about where our Organizing for Power teams are. So Organizing for Power, we have 12 teams. Our teams are in Alabama, Atlanta, Colorado, Florida, Louisiana, Michigan, New York, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, South Carolina. Then we have 2 teams in Texas, and we have one in Houston, and we have one in Dallas, Fort Worth. So if we look at where those are, we have a lot of ability to impact a lot of these electoral votes in a lot of these states. So let's see. It looks like we got a couple of questions here about how do you get an initiative on the ballot? And I'm going to look to Breanna or Kelly to go ahead and answer those.
Yeah, so I wrote in the text box that it varies state to state. So typically, you a citizen of that state or resident of that state could have an issue with a particular code in the state code, and you have to create a petition. There's a bunch of formal paperwork you have to do with a particular agency at the state level. You make your petition, you go door to door knocking, asking people to sign your petition, and it can be like 10,000 signatures. It can be 50,000 signatures. It depends on the state, how many signatures you need. And then you have to turn in that petition back to a state agency, get all the signatures verified to make sure those are residents of the state. And then maybe if you've met the timeline, if you've met the verified signatures, and after you've paid some money, because this stuff takes a lot of money, then it might be added to the ballot. But again, the exact numbers, who you go to, the cost, all of that varies state to state.
Great. Thank you, Breanna. And then another question that came up earlier in the chat box is, how do we influence all of this red? And I, said a lot of our Organizing for Power, but do you have any comments, any of our panelists or Ebony that you would like to talk about? Like, this looks pretty overwhelming. What do we do?
Organized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
we have organizing for power in a lot of these red states. We also have state leads in some of these red states. We just need to start working, and chapters in some of these red states. We just need to start working within the systems to organize, organize, organize. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things is when you hear something like about the Electoral College, or you start to understand how it works and how it's been used to disenfranchise communities and disempower communities, it can be hard to undermine that. So folks see this, and the initial reaction might be something like, why vote? And so undoing that and helping people to realize like the power in their vote, I think is a really huge component when you're all getting out there, you're organizing, and you're getting out the vote, you're reaching folks who haven't maybe been touched before. And so I think that that's really good. So you have the knowledge, you understand how the system works because of these Organizing for Power webinars. It's going to position you better when people push back at you about like, why should I even care?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, Kelly, about the populations who are not being touched. So a lot of folks coming out of incarceration who are in community corrections, they don't know that they have the right to vote. It's about educating the people about their rights, and also getting to those hard to reach populations.
So if there are people who are attendees who would like to ask a question, if your fingers are not able to move fast enough, or maybe you're on the phone, go ahead and raise your hand and we'll take you off of mute and you can go ahead and just ask it so you don't have to type out all the details. I think while we're waiting to see. Yeah, so this is Jesse Mona. That's a great question. While we're waiting to see if somebody wants to come off of mute, Jesse Mona asked, talking about Democratic versus Republican Party and that you can only vote in one in the primary. What happens if you're an independent? That's a really important question. Anyone want to take it?
I can try and address this, and please correct me if I'm wrong. So there are some states that have open primaries that allow you to vote in them even if you are not a member of that political party, but a lot of states don't, and so it's a real limitation. If you're not in like the Democratic Party, something like the Democratic a local precinct caucusing for a Democratic candidate, or having a Democratic primary, you might not be able to vote in that. I'm not sure if folks have more to add other than that.
Yeah, Kelly, I think that's a great point. So that's part of the reason why we talked about precincts and caucuses and state conventions, is that political parties run the system. And so if you are not registered with a political party, oftentimes you are missing out on a lot of the really early organizing. And in some states like Colorado, because we're just a little funky out here, if you're a registered independent, because they knew that people were really missing out on the early part of the process. In Colorado, if you're registered as an independent, we are a primary state, which means you get a ballot to vote on for who you choose. And if you're an independent, you get both. So you can choose if you want to vote on the Democratic ballot or the Republican ballot in the primary, but that is pretty unusual. And so we'll be able to talk more about sort of how people get involved in the early days of the organizing, but it's important. A number of people in Iowa, which has very early caucuses, have been able to get access to a lot of the presidential candidates because they're registered in a party and are able to go to caucus events. And so when we think about what your state looks like, again, super complicated. Every state is different, but it's going to be important to think about where you want to be involved and how you want to impact your state.
I have a question and a comment. This is Ebony. My question is, when we were talking about the Electoral College and the party electing the electors, and they get elected, they get decided upon within the party, would it make sense to say people should get involved in a party to potentially become an elector in an electoral college? And I guess my question to that is, how often do they nominate or vote for electors in the electoral college? I hope that made sense.
That totally made sense, and it's a really good point. Thank you for bringing us back to it. So to your first point, y'all remember when I was talking about the faithless electors? That's something that the parties are really scared of. And so actually what they tend to do whether it's nomination through a party convention or through a little tiny party committee, they tend to nominate folks to be electors who they think that they can trust, who they think that once that person pledges their vote, that they're going to vote in line with whichever candidate the Democrats nominate, or whichever candidate the Republicans nominate. They want someone they can trust, someone who's been in the party, who's been showing up to things, who they know is, or they think is, aligned with their values and they can count on. So to answer your question, yes, if that's something that you want is to become an elector, it does help to be involved in party politics. And then the other part of the question was,
how often do they, is this a every election year thing, or? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Every 4 years, just like presidential elections.
Does this mean for the 2016 elections that those faithless voters went against their people?
It does. And so one of the weird facts about this, faithless electors actually don't happen all that often. This was something like the 5th election where it happened. And there was a huge push out there to get electors who had pledged to vote for the Republican candidate, who was Trump, to switch to anyone else. There's a huge push. People actually went out and tried to bribe some electors. And what happened was that the Republican Party then, when it found out which electors they thought were going to become faithless electors and vote for someone than Trump, they swapped them out. The way that this ended up playing out in 2016 is that there were 8 faithless electors. 5 switched their vote. They were pledged to Hillary and voted for something else. Only 3 were pledged to Trump and voted with someone else. So it's a dangerous game.
One last question on this, and I actually am going down a rabbit hole, and I'm gonna stop after this. But do they have the potential to be bribed?
I mean, everybody has potential.
That Electoral College.
Yeah, it's if it's legal or not is the question.
Yes, exactly what Breanna just said.
I wasn't asking because I would say anybody from PWN is doing any bribing. I was just asking because I think the other party, the party that won, might have bribed some people.
Yes.
All right. So, Shanika, I think, did you have your hand up to ask a question? I went ahead and I took you off of mute, so you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you wanted to ask a question.
I was just saying, and when Kelly was describing the process, I'm like, it sounds like that movie Distinguished Gentleman that Eddie Murphy played in. If anybody's ever watched that, it describes that exact process of the person that he was playing in during the Congress and House of Representatives when he was doing the election cycle. It's a good movie, but you gotta watch it.
we all have a movie assignment then for before the boot camp, so that we can all go ahead and show up and talk about it. So these are great questions. We've had a couple of questions about, are we going to review all of this information at boot camp again? We are not. We're going to move forward from here. So if there are questions, let us know so that we can go ahead and talk about it in a little bit more detail. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and finish up our last part of our webinar, and we will be able to just continue to talk about all of this, really. Looks like Kelly listed off the states that have agreed to follow the popular vote: California, Colorado, Connecticut, District of Columbia, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Massachusetts, Maryland, New Jersey, Oregon, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Washington. So the reason why I'm reading it is that the chat box doesn't actually show up in the recording. And I do think it's important to say that in Colorado, while we have indeed passed through our General Assembly an agreement to follow the popular vote of the nation with our Electoral College votes, true to Breanna's example about issues being put on the ballot when people don't agree with it, in Colorado we have a recall of that on our ballot coming up in Colorado. So that's going to be some of our organizing that we're going to be doing to make sure that that stands, because that is the way around the Electoral College for sure. So, homework. Everybody ready for your homework? First off, we got to watch The Distinguished Gentleman with Eddie Murphy. Then we have a little bit more research for people to do. So we would like each member of your team to go ahead and research who is your federal representative. That's your person who's in the House of Representatives at the federal level. What congressional district you're in, or CV, are you in? Which committees does your representative and senator sit on? So those are going to be 3 or 4 committees that they sit on that'll be very interesting. And we'll talk a little bit more at the boot camp about why that is important. Who is your state senator, and what stat Senate district are you in? State Senate district are you in? Who is your state representative or delegate, and which state House district are you in? So basically we want to know who are your people that you're going to be talking to about running for office, and what committees do they sit on, and you're influencing what bills they're introducing. So this is for your team's information. You can go ahead and send each other the answers in emails, or you can keep it in your own personal notes. But we're going to go ahead and talk about it more at the boot camp. So that's the homework. And then, as always, we like to list out our next steps, so it feels like we've got a lot of stuff that's overwhelming. Here it is broken down kind of simple. September 24th, we need to have all of the names of the teams, who the teams are sending to boot camp, and ask people please to go ahead and fill out that logistics letter, that survey. There was a problem with the Google link. It worked for some people, it didn't work for other people. It is now open and fresh again, and we'll send it out in an email tomorrow with the slides and the recording from this webinar. So please go ahead and send us the names of your boot camp attendees, as well as your logistics letter. Fill that out online. Then October 10th, we've got our 4th Organizing for Power webinar, and that is going to be Getting Out the Vote, GOTV, which is Getting Out the Vote, and how you plan those campaigns. And then October 22nd, we'll have our Organizing for Power webinar number 5. That'll be Preparing for Boot Camp. What do you need to know? What do you want to come prepared to talk about? All of that. And then October 27th to November 1st is going to be our Organizing for Power Boot Camp in Atlanta. So those are the next steps. And with that, I want to just see if there are any last minute questions, either about the homework, the next steps, or anything else. And yes, it does sound like the policy fellowship assignment. I think I might have cheated and taken it off of one of their assignments because they're awesome. You know, I'm saying that not just because we've got the entire policy department on this webinar. It's just awesome. And Kelly is asking if there are any questions that we missed in the chat box, or if there are any last inquiries. And yes, we will send everybody the homework tomorrow. It'll be written down, as well as the homework from the last webinar, which was to meet with your teams, sit down and talk about who your allies and your partners are going to be for your getting out the vote in your electoral organizing, 3 to 5 of those. But we'll go ahead and send that all out for everybody, because I know that there are a number of people who are multitasking or who aren't able to join us today. So with that, why don't we just go ahead and see through our presenters if there's any last thoughts or comments. Kelly, you got anything you want to add?
I have nothing to add other than saying I was very impressed with you all and your ability to figure out what the terms were, where you're clearly working from a really great base. The Electoral College stuff is really, really complicated. I'm still wrapping my head around it, so we'll return to it. If you have questions, please, please, please email me, Barb, Breanna, and we'll get back to you.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Breanna, any last thoughts?
Yeah, just y'all are amazing, and you have such a long journey ahead of you to influence the 2020 election, but I know we can do it. And Kelly and I will always be here to help answer questions and explain the unnecessarily complicated systems that exist throughout electoral organizing.
Great, thank you. And Rica?
Sorry, couldn't find my mute button. I just say, like, man, bring it. We gotta make some changes. We gotta make some changes that affect us and people like us. And I'm always open to, if anybody needs support, if there's anything that I can help out with, please feel free to reach out to me as well.
Wonderful. And Ebony, any last thoughts or comments? Ebony might still be down in that rabbit hole. All right, so it looks like Yolanda's got a last minute question. Yolanda, I'm going to go ahead and take you off of mute. Go ahead. And Yolanda, it looks like you've got your phone muted, so if you have a, if you want to ask, there you go. Now we can hear you.
I'm on mute. I was just talking by myself. So I was just saying that you could take a picture if you're on your phone of the homework.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
for
what
a number
I
of people. Yeah, that's a great idea, Yolanda.
You know,
Thank you for sharing that.
Snapshot. How you say the shot? Screenshot.
Yeah.
Of the
homework. That's a great idea. That's why Yolanda, you know, can share all of the tips and tricks with us for sure. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah. All right, wonderful. So I just want to thank everybody again for being a part of this webinar. It was a lot of information. I know that I actually am going to go back and watch it over again because, you know, the Electoral College, while it's really frustrating and seems very complicated, it is that way on purpose. So we for sure want to make sure we understand it, and so we can talk about how we can influence both people via the Electoral College, but also how we can explain where it's really frustrating and how our communities can overcome that. So by getting out the vote, getting new people enrolled and engaged in voter education, that is how we are going to be able to influence that. So thank you all so much for joining. Have a great evening. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording, and thank you all for being a part of our meeting. And thanks to all the amazing, and thank you to the amazing presenters. So have a good evening and thank you.